have to tell you something. I cheated on my husband of 3 years when he was away on a business trip. I didn't mean to, and now I don't know what to do. I thought I'd come here to ask for advice. I still love my husband, but sometimes he didn't give me the attention I wanted. Even before we got married, it was always his business first. He said he was trying to make money for my betterment, but I didn't see it. I saw it as him being thoughtless and neglectful. My husband could travel for weeks on end, only popping by for a few days to see me before taking off again to his next business meeting. The funny thing was, they had always been around the world. None of them had been at our home base normally. Questions would pop into your head about the weirdness of the trips, right? I mean, had you all been in my shoes, you would have had doubts that something was going on, even if I didn't have any doubts about that. I knew I'd feel lonely. I did have questions though, so I apologize for that. It backfired on me with my husband when I confronted him about the regularity of his business trips. I decided to return the favor. I know what I did was stupid, but I wasn't thinking. I was alone and had needs. My husband was traveling around the world, probably with women at his back. I'm thinking of what happened when I had confronted him about his. He just got back from one of his trips, and I threw a tantrum. I told him I was going to leave the marriage if he kept cheating on me while he was away. I was joking at the time, but I was really angry, so I lost my cool. I told him I knew he was cheating on me on his business trips and I had evidence. I was bluffing, but my husband didn't know that, and I thought, what if he was really cheating and I was just the stay-at-home wife? At the time, I thought my husband was cheating on me. I was wrong about being a trophy wife. After all my tantrums, my husband didn't seem to care that I was talking about my problems and those of our marriage. He'd gone to sleep, and the next morning he'd left on a trip. By the time I'd woken up, he'd called me irrelevant in so many ways. He'd even left a note saying that if I left the marriage, I felt like I was just a disposable toy to him. I'm sure you would have retaliated if you had been in my place, so I did what I said I would. I hadn't meant to cheat on my husband, but our last fight was always on my mind. Even when he came back from the trip, he had disappeared on me. He never apologized. He kept going on trips and we barely spoke to each other. It was just an awkward silence. I couldn't take it anymore. Maybe my cheating was a way to get his attention. I wanted him to know that he couldn't leave me and expect me to be okay with it. I had to get back at him. I slept with his personal gym trainer. I'm sorry if you think I planned it. I didn't. I've already said that I didn't plan it, it just kind of happened. My husband's personal gym trainer happened to be at the house one day when my husband wasn't around, and I fell into temptation. I succumbed with revenge on the back of my mind. My husband's personal gym trainer had come by for their scheduled workout in the gym, but didn't know my husband had gone on a trip, or that he had mixed up the schedule. I guess you could say the fates were against me. I'm not superstitious, but I had asked the gym trainer to show me some exercises to trim my abdomen and waist. I didn't want his trip to be a waste, so I ended up tangled in the sheets. That's how I had cheated on my husband. My husband came back a week later, and I was filled with guilt. The guilt started to build up again, and my husband started talking to me and being sweet. He took me out for dinner during one of his weekends off, which was a lovely experience. The restaurant was my favorite in Edmond, and everything was just amazing. However, I couldn't be at peace because of the guilt eating me up. My husband didn't stop there, he also took me out shopping. It was something he'd only done a few times in our 3 years of marriage. It felt like he knew what I'd done and was sweetening me up before springing a trap. I was always scared of his every move. The icing on the cake of my husband's turnaround was when he stayed home with me. He stayed home and was the perfect husband. Whenever his personal gym trainer came, he was guilt tripled. He'd go to the gym on his scheduled workout days, and on the days I couldn't breathe, I couldn't confess. My husband was finally beginning to be more like the man I had married, the man I had fallen in love with. My name is Elsa, I'm 28, and my husband's name is Will, he's 31. We met when he was interning with the IT company opposite the Starbucks coffee shop where I had worked part-time. I needed to get some money to complete my course at Oklahoma City's community college. My friends still tease me about how our meeting had been like something out of a fairy tale. They think our relationship was meant to be, but I just thought it was corny. He'd come to get a coffee for his boss, Rick, but I'd misinterpreted it as Dick. So, as he was approaching for his order, I said something like, "One dick coming right up." Everyone had a good laugh. We had a good laugh about it, and I was quite embarrassed at the time. It was a memorable moment. That's how my husband and I first met. He used to come in to buy coffee, and we continued seeing each other even after I left and started working full-time. We started dating and got engaged a year later. My first year of marriage was wonderful. It was the best year I'd ever had. I felt loved and pampered, and I was shown a lot of kindness. He took me on a few trips. He took me on trips and showed me he cared, which made me fall in love with him even more. My second year of marriage was as good as my first, but with new adventures. My third year was when he got his job and things began to slow down. I got into a mess of a situation. Everything was perfect. There was no need to tell him. If he had somehow found out, I probably would have said he had cheated too. There was no point in bringing the cat out of the bag when the sleeping dog was lying down. That would cause commotion and fights. I wasn't ready. I was ready to face my husband again. Everything seemed perfect. Our third wedding anniversary was coming up, and my husband decided we would stay at a nice hotel out of town to celebrate. We got to the hotel, checked into our rooms, and had a rest. We woke up for our romantic dinner, and that's when the bubble I had been living in for a while burst. My husband started getting text notifications throughout the entire dinner. He said it was work, but something about his attitude was off. He was acting really weird. He stayed on his phone all night, replying to each text notification without even minding he was in my company. Maybe the whole dinner and the princess treatment was to sweeten me up for the wrongs he was about to do. I don't know, but I was really annoyed. Once again, I felt like I was irrelevant. I felt like I was insignificant, and insignificant things don't matter. I didn't know what to do, so I sat there the whole dinner. The guilt was still there though. Do you think I should come clean and allow him to treat me worse than he has been doing? Or do you think I should stay quiet? This is an update to my story after my husband dropped me off at home and traveled for another 2 weeks or so. I cheated again. This time, I had planned it. It was with his personal trainer again. He had shown me care whenever he came by to check if my husband was in. I had thought several times that he could have just called my husband to ask if he was around instead of coming by the house, but he had done it for me. He saw how lonely I felt and decided to come by on my husband's training days. One day we slept with each other again. He was there when my husband wasn't. I had never felt so at ease in my life. I was feeling pretty lonely, so I started coming by on my husband's training days. One day, we slept with each other again. He was there when my husband wasn't, and I'd never felt so at ease. I know you all expected me to come clean to my husband since my last Reddit update, but what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. I was worried that if I told my husband everything that had happened, he would do something drastic. So I didn't tell him, and I continued sleeping with my husband's personal trainer. My husband hadn't shown for more than 2 weeks, and I began to panic. At first I thought he was avoiding me, but then I realized that wasn't the case. I'd been in touch with his family, but then I started to panic when I got a call from the hospital. My husband had been in there for a week and didn't want to see anyone. I rushed to the hospital and found my husband. The good news was that he was already recovering. The bad news was that he had to stop my husband started staying in the house because the doctor said he should. This was what I'd always wanted, but I was in trouble with my husband's personal gym trainer. The guy was delusional. He thought we were exclusive, and I was getting a divorce from my husband. Can you imagine the nerve of it? He had free reign over the house whenever he came in for their training. He thought he could use that to his advantage whenever my husband was around. His personal trainer always thought that was his opportunity to touch me. I didn't know what to do. I had warned him several times that it was just an affair and nothing else. Now my husband was back. I was done with him. He had just laughed. I had made a small cheating mistake. He was a psychopath. Despite my severe warnings, his advances didn't stop. One day, my husband almost caught us. I was terrified. I had to think of an excuse fast. It was one of my husband's training days. His trainer had come to the house as usual. After their training session, he came into the kitchen. I was getting some water. He grabbed my butt as he walked to the fridge. That's when it happened. At the same time, my husband walked into the kitchen and saw another man's hands on my backside. I was at a loss for words. Fortunately, the trainer came up with an excuse that he had seen something wrong with my dress and wanted to help. I think my husband had noticed something was wrong since that day and started asking me strange questions. I lied, of course, but the good part was that my husband's gym trainer I was told to stop coming to the house. I was finally at peace from all the harassment, and my husband was at home, although he wasn't talking to me and always looked for a reason to leave the house. I was glad that he was at least coming home. Everything was fine in my world, or so I thought. Then I found a picture of me in a compromising position with my husband's gym trainer in my mail. It came with a blackmail letter that said I had to deposit $100. I was told to put $1,000 into the checking account or risk my husband finding out about the affair I'd had. I was being blackmailed. I couldn't believe I was being blackmailed by that man just because I'd felt lonely and had sought companionship. Someone had the nerve to think he had the right to blackmail me. Well, he had more than the right because of how foolish I'd been, but I wasn't the only one at fault. I was paying for it. The threats and pictures didn't stop coming. I was scared that my husband might come across the emails and find out what I'd done. I was also scared that the man might try other ways of blackmailing me and even confront my husband, which would be 10 times worse. My husband was my rock, my source of stability, my provider. He was always there for me. There was a time when he would leave everything to come and comfort me when I was having a bad day. Back when I was still completing my college degree. Just one phone call from me crying and he was there. I felt like he was already close by. I didn't have close family or friends, he was that for me. I didn't mean to cheat on him, as I've repeated several times in the course of this narration. I didn't want to lose him, so I pulled all my strings. I used up the little savings I had accumulated since I stopped feeding and providing for myself and put it in the account as the note had said. I waited to see what else would happen. I thought everything had ended, as I didn't hear anything from the blackmailer. I was wrong. It turned out my blackmailer, as it turned out, my husband's gym trainer was the same person. I should have seen it coming. Redditors, I should have picked up on the signs. Nope, I was blind. So blind it seemed. I found out my husband had allowed his personal gym trainer to start coming back into the house to train him. I also found out I was being blackmailed, the hard way. A week or so after my husband's personal gym trainer started coming to the house, his advances started up again. I found out a while later that he had blackmailed me. I would be passing by and he would slap my. Sometimes he would grab me by the neck and forcefully kiss me. It was borderline abusive, and with my husband in the same house, it was clear he had no respect for him at all. I got tired of it and confronted him. I told him to stop with his advances and warned him that I was going to tell my husband if he didn't stop. That's when I found out he was the blackmailer. He had told me something along the lines of, "May the first person win," and told me to start preparing more money because he was almost running out of it. I gave him a stash and his mouth was always open unless it was shut with money. I'd never hated anybody the way I hated him at that moment. From then on, the advances got worse. My husband would be in the living room and I'd be in the kitchen. His personal trainer would grab me and forcefully kiss me. I know you're wondering where my husband was in this situation. I told him I'd complained that his trainer was giving me a bad vibe. He said he didn't see anything weird about it. I told him so many times, but it fell on deaf ears. I was left to deal with it alone because I couldn't come clean and tell my husband what I had done. The advances didn't stop, and I was close to filing a police complaint against him, but that would lead to questions. I had no friends to talk it out with. If I had, I probably wouldn't be in this situation. My husband just wasn't ready to listen to me. Well, a bonus point was that he was finally talking to me, even though it was still I knew I'd done something wrong, but I just didn't have the time to deal with it as I had other things on my mind. It was a combination of things, not just one mistake. I was going through a lot of stress and anxiety. I could barely sleep and was always on the lookout for anything in the mail. I was also dealing with my husband's personal trainer, who was becoming bolder. He'd even come to the house when my husband was out and make threats. His latest one was a request for $200. I didn't know where I was going to get that money. The last blackmail had cleared all my life savings and I had next to nothing to be able to pay off this one. I was confused on so many levels that I had to sell the jewelry my husband had given me. I had pawned all my jewelry, and if my husband noticed, he didn't say a word. He still didn't see anything when I told him again that the vibes, his personal gym trainer, was wrong. I mean, wasn't a husband supposed to support his wife? He was supposed to get rid of any worries of his wife. Well, mine didn't seem to even know that something was totally wrong with me. The threats became worse and worse every time the gym trainer stopped by. He said he needed the money. I had 3 days or the cat was going to let out the bag. I didn't know where else to get the money, seeing as I had no friends or family to ask. So I did a drastic move. I applied for a loan at the bank and used one of my husband's cars that he barely used for collateral. In my desperation, I resorted to desperate measures. I was in a situation that was way below the belt. I had no way of repaying the loan, so I planned to take my husband's car out for a drive and fake that it had been stolen. I didn't think it through. I know, but I had no other option. I just needed that person off my back. I was foolish, of course. You don't need to tell me in the comments. I was utterly foolish because I didn't think the threats would. If I didn't tell my husband or do something to get rid of his personal trainer, I'd have to do it eventually. I decided to do that by the 3rd time he came around to ask for money. It hadn't even been up to 3 weeks since I had deposited the last one I had loaned from the bank, and the guy was back for the next one. It was like I was his monthly paycheck, and he was having fun pulling my strings. That's when I knew this had to stop, because I was running out of options and I had no place to get his request for $300. I'd already taken my husband's car to pawn it and get money to settle my bank loan. Thankfully, my husband hadn't placed insurance on that particular car, and somehow, by my lucky break, he hadn't noticed the car was missing yet. But he was starting to make threats. I knew I had to get rid of him when I found a picture of us together in an envelope on my matrimonial bed. He was going to leave. It was too far gone. If I didn't do something immediately, he'd do worse and ruin my marriage. So I planned to spoil his image in front of my husband. I started small, doing something he wouldn't notice. I just blurred everything out to my husband. My husband's phone got missing first. I began planting ideas in my husband's head that it was him. After all, he was the only person we allowed into the house. I made sure to always have something of my husband go missing, only when his personal trainer was around. I knew that the missing car was going to be the last straw, but first I had to put my husband's personal trainer and me in a compromising position that my husband would see with his clear eyes. I got my opportunity after one of my husband's training sessions was over. I had worn a moderately seductive dress and positioned myself at the space between the door of the kitchen and the entrance of our home gym space. I positioned myself between the kitchen door and the entrance to our home gym, hoping my husband would see me clearly and that his personal trainer wouldn't be able to resist touching me in the open. I was right on all counts. My husband's personal trainer squeezed my breasts at the same time my husband got to the gym entrance, and I screamed at the same time. My acting was top-notch. I thought I'd definitely get the part if I applied for an acting gig. My husband got really angry and almost ended up in a fight with his personal trainer. If I hadn't stepped in, they'd have had a fight. 2 days later, my husband noticed his car was missing. I suggested his trainer had taken it. My husband filed for the arrest of his personal trainer. I'd been smart to get photocopies of the car documents, the minor things I had made go missing in his possession to make it all look real. If you had told me 3 months ago that I would find myself in this position, battling with lies, bank loans, minor thefts, and police involvement, I would have called you a liar. But that's where I had seen myself. At least my fellow Redditors, my problems were finally over. I didn't know how wrong I was. My problems were far from over. A while after the involvement with his personal trainer, I woke up to divorce papers from my husband. He had served me divorce papers and had left. I couldn't even approach him to ask what had gone wrong or what had happened. Since the squat with his personal trainer, we'd been cool and as close as we'd been before he started traveling again. I could tell he missed traveling, but he'd never said anything about it, so I wasn't worried. But how could that have brought on a divorce? I could say that was one of the least things I was expecting to happen to me. After all I'd done not to lose him, I was going to end up losing him. I had been the perfect wife. the perfect companion, the perfect lover. I had put him on a high pedestal and done everything I knew as a way of apologizing. Well, I had done everything except telling him what I had actually done in the first place. I had done it all not to lose him, and somehow I had lost him. He knew my husband knew I had cheated on him. That was the reason for the divorce papers he had found out somehow. And I got to know from his friends who had given me the stink eye when I had met up with them to ask if they knew. I wanted to know where my husband was. He'd told all of them why he was leaving me. He'd told everyone except me how he'd found out. That's what I wondered, all the way back from his friend's place. I didn't think about the bad treatment they'd given me. I deserved it, but I also deserved to know why he was getting divorced. His personal trainer had definitely gotten to him. There was no other way he would have found out except through that route. This was revenge for getting him arrested. Surely my husband's personal, it seemed like the gym trainer was getting back at me. Everything had just gone from bad to worse in the blink of an eye. A week later, my husband's lawyer came to deliver another divorce notice. The previous one had gone missing, and he told me my husband needed it signed and out of his house before he took drastic action. That was the most heartbreaking news I had received in a while. I didn't have any other place to stay, and my husband knew it. If he was doing this, it meant he didn't care if I was homeless. He just wanted me gone. It was one of the worst days of my life. I regretted ever giving in to the temptation that came from loneliness. My savings were gone. My jewelry had all been pawned, and I had nothing. I was going back to the start because of one mistake. I had never been more disappointed in myself. Well, I signed the papers because I didn't have a choice. The signing of the papers had a time limit, but I made one final request before I gave away the divorce papers. I wanted to hand them over to my husband directly. We had a lot to talk about, even though I had been the guy who caused our marriage to fall apart, had a part to play in it, and I wanted to talk to him about it. My husband's lawyer set up the meeting. I was pretty determined to go through with it. My husband seemed to think he could get rid of me that easily without dealing with how the whole thing started. His business trips had caused most of our problems, and he wouldn't admit it. The meeting day came, and I went to my husband's lawyer's office to find my husband already there. He looked calm and collected. Well, he hadn't lost his whole life in vain. He didn't know what it was like. Well, I couldn't blame him. I had dug my grave right. I sat, and my husband's lawyer left us to give us privacy to talk. That's how I found out my husband knew all along that I had cheated on him. He'd known since the second time I'd invited his personal trainer to my bed. He'd been playing games with me the whole time. It felt like I was living in a fairy tale as my husband told me everything from his point of view. He said he came back early from one of his trips in an Uber, which wasn't his usual car. He'd seen his personal trainer leave the house, which was also where I'd been. I'd walked to the balcony looking disheveled and well slept. He put two and two together, but he couldn't just jump to conclusions. He watched us all the while. I'd thought he'd been on a trip. He'd been watching our activities and found out his trainer had been coming into the house on days he wasn't supposed to. My husband said that was how he'd ended up in the hospital. He said it was all my fault. He'd even thought about ending it. But he wanted to gather evidence and see if I'd admit to cheating on him while he was away. That's how he came back to watch us more closely. He knew about his personal trainer's advances towards me, but he hadn't done anything because it seemed like I was enjoying it. He got rid of his personal trainer and brought him back to watch us. He wanted to see me squirm and try to hide my mistake. All he wanted was for me to admit. I kept quiet about what I had done, pretending everything was fine. I was lying through my teeth. He knew about the blackmail from his personal trainer, the jewelry I had pawned, the bank loan and car I had used as collateral, which he had got back from the bank. I thought I was in the clear. He knew about all the missing items I had planted on his personal trainer to get him arrested. He had played along, thinking that maybe with his trainer gone, I would finally tell him that I had cheated. But I didn't say anything. He gave me so many chances to prove to him that what had happened was a mistake. He knew he had played a role with all the business trips and all the times he had left me alone, knowing the only friends I had were his. I couldn't go to them on my own, so he gave me so many chances. But I decided to sweep it under the rug, and that was what he couldn't accept. He decided he couldn't stay married to me, to say I was weak after my husband finished narrating his views of the events of the past. 2+ months was an understatement. I was drained, to say the least. He had given me so many opportunities to come clean, and I hadn't. I had kept quiet out of fear of losing him, and I had lost him in the end. All my planning and craftiness to avoid being cast aside, and here I was going through the exact thing I had feared. I narrated my own point of the whole ordeal to him and told him how sorry I was that this was happening to us. I knew there was no chance of him taking me back, and I had learned my lesson. I handed over the divorce papers. I left with my pride before I threw it to the wind and begged him to let me stay. I told him how we could still make our marriage work. That story of my life was over and done with. There wasn't going to be any going back. Well, I became a single woman living in a very tiny studio room and working for a media agency. 3 months later, I still missed my husband. Of course, I still regretted that day with every fiber of my being. But what's done is done. I just had to get through my day one step at a time. However, a certain someone wasn't done with me. My husband's personal trainer showed up again 4 months later. It was scary when he attacked me on my way back from work, threatening to tell my boss what I really was. I'd only started the job a month ago. I wasn't scared for the job though. The next 2 nights I found my room thoroughly scattered with pictures of our night together glued to the walls. It was time to file for a restraining order against him before he put me under the knife or poisoned me out of spite. I went to the police station to do that, and my husband came in after I'd filed the report. It turned out he was still listed as my emergency contact. We had a chat, and there were no bad vibes between us. It was nice to see we could start over as friends. I never saw his personal trainer again after I filed the restraining order. Everything was finally all right in my world. I didn't have my husband, but I had his forgiveness, and I had my life at peace once more. Thanks, Redditors, for sharing my experience with me. I know I deserved everything that came to me. But finally, I learned to appreciate everything I had. I started to feel better about myself and the people around me. I began to value relationships and learned how to speak up and avoid mistakes. I also started therapy, so I don't have to deal with tempting situations anymore. I'm learning to control myself, my ex-husband, and the situations we sometimes still meet up in, like at a cafe or KFC. I hope I get to experience love like my ex. My husband showed me that I wouldn't mess up like I did with my ex. It's not every day you meet your person. I hope you've learned from my experience. The person you think you're protecting by not telling them the truth will appreciate it more when you let them in. You may be trying hard not to lose someone and end up doing what pushes them away. Please learn from my cheating mistake. I hope none of you has to go through what I did.